Hi there, Glocal Citizens. Welcome back to the podcast that inspires a borderless mindset around manifesting a new world. I am your host, Florence Adu, coming to you with a Black History Month special. This week on the podcast, it's Flashback February, inspired by last year's Black History Month compilation episode. This week, I've selected globally speaking, mindset hacking, and solutionscaping excerpts from conversations over the past year. Starting with the science mercenary, Dr. Hakeem Oluseyi, on how reconceptualizing our ideas on time and how the evolutionary continuum of human intelligence need not be as complicated as we think. Cognitive behavioral research scientist Dr. Juleen Christopher reinforces his thoughts by introducing us to her mindset hack, a technique called positive intelligence, and how a commitment to telling ourselves and living a story contrary to those embedded in social injustice are at the bedrock of her activism. Cultural practitioner Kobby furthers the story as he elaborates on his mindset hack, collaboration, and how its revival in the African psyche is critical to progress. Communication specialist and cultural curator Samba Yonga then illustrates how our African histories reinforce this collaborative ethic and is using her museum as a narrative activism necessary to re-inform a new now. And finally, globally speaking, the moneymaker, Eric Collins, puts his money where his mouth is, investing in the change that he and his partners at Impact X Capital intend to see in Black communities across Europe. The common thread in my selections is activism, which is the why of Black History Month. Waking each morning in parts of the world rife with injustice is in itself an act of courageous resistance. We must challenge ourselves to uplift untold stories and unheard voices so that by valuing global Black histories, we can collectively build, simply put, a better today. That is the definition of glocal citizenship. And now, Dr. Hakeem Oluseyi.
One of the first things I realized was, I said to myself, I looked at the people around me and I was like, man, you guys are ultra educated, but you're not intrinsically smarter than people I grew up around, right? And I thought, with regard to myself, I was like, okay, you guys are all way better educated than me, but can't none of you outwork me, right? So I'm going to, nose to the grindstone. I'm going to catch you and I'm going to surpass you.
Right.
Give me a few years.
Right.
There's no way around the hard work, and it just takes time.
Exactly.
Yeah, and when you're inefficient at it when you're young, right now, I know that given a good problem, I could be the world's expert in some topic in like 18 to 24 months, right?
Right, because you have a system. You understand how to go through the rigors. You understand all of that.
Exactly. It's very efficient now, just getting there to the point, right?
Sure.
Yeah. And when you're young and inefficient, you just don't know the system, how to do it.
Right.
It's like LeBron playing basketball now versus young LeBron.
Right. Yeah.
He had all of that athletic talent, but the efficiency was just, not the same. Now he gets the same thing done with a lot less motion.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. So that's a good segue into my mindset hack question.
Yeah.
So what is your favorite or an innovative mindset hack? One that you know, one that you practice, one that you can imagine?
Yeah, I have had to hack my mindset all my life to get myself through things. I tell myself things, right?
Yeah.
And so this came out of physics for me. It's not anything. It's like there's a lot of discoveries that I make that I discover we already discovered. Go all the way back to college, right? So of course Albert Einstein discovered this first, figured this out first, but I was sitting thinking one day, I think about space and time a lot, and a foundational physicist, one of the founders of astroparticle physics, this guy named Rocky Cobb, also from New Orleans, but he spent his entire career in Chicago. We were having dinner one night back in 2003 in Chicago, and we were talking about having these deep insights to make really revolutionary changes in physics and how we understand the universe. And he said, yeah, man, it's like that Mark Twain saying. It's an apocryphal Mark Twain saying. It's not what you don't know, it's what you know that ain't so. Right? And, he talked about at that moment in that conversation how Albert Einstein, with his revolution in space and time, turned over what we all thought we knew to be true, which wasn't, right?
Right.
So anyway, I started thinking about, what do we know? What could I possibly know that ain't so, right? And, I also think about, like, what could different realities be that I wouldn't be able to do an experiment to differentiate between them? Because ultimately, it comes down to what you observe to be true is what is true, right? And you do that through experiments or rigorous observations, right?
Yeah.
So in that thinking, I thought to myself, I was like, time. You and I are sitting here next to this microphone, and we call this moment that we're sharing now. And we believe, collectively as humans, that our now is the actual now of the universe.
Right.
That there's that history that led up to this moment, and now this now is the actual real now. But then I was like, but wait, every conscious being who has ever lived or who will ever live has that exact same thought. So what makes my now the actual now? This means to me now that all timelines are co-equal and all times are co-equal. Now, the way Einstein expressed this was in a letter to a bereaved friend who had lost her spouse. I think she was a woman. And basically he said, don't be so sad, because if you could see time the way God does, it's just all out there. So one way of thinking of it is, when the universe began, you and I were here having this conversation, right? So anyway, how do I use that as a mind hack? I say to myself, as far as I know, it's already 1 billion years from now and I'm already dead. So what is there to be embarrassed about? What is there to hold back about? So a lot of this stuff that I do, that's performance, right? How do you come across well as a voice actor? How do you come across well on camera? It's really simple. Be yourself, right? Be true to your real emotions. Be who you really are in that contrived moment, right? But it's so hard, right? It's so hard. We often will be what we think we're supposed to be. If you look at TED Talks, they all kind of talk the same, right? It's a style, right? Because that's what I do as a TED Talk. And
Exactly.
And the same thing goes with different careers, right? Physicists talk like physicists, teachers, and so that's why I personally don't talk like a physicist.
Right,
I'm purposefully ebonic-y.
Yourself,
I'm just being myself, because I'm also showing that I talk this way, but hell yeah, I'm brilliant. And I'm not brilliant because I'm smart. I don't believe in smart. It's what has actually been accomplished, right? It is don't talk to me, don't ask me, go look at the work, go look up the papers, go look up the patents. That's what it is, right? Talk to the people who've had the impact. That's the real thing. And I talk like this. I need to go to a dentist. You know what I mean? It's like, we judge each other on these shallow things. And one thing that, I see myself as a human, right? I'm in this sci-fi world, right? So I want us to be one planet, all working together. And I'm like, if we could do that, we would be Star Trek tomorrow. But we're always trying to one-up each other. We're doing all these...
the hierarchies.
All the hierarchies, all the BS, all this stuff. And I'm just like, let's just be productive, work together and just be dope, right? So that's my mind hack that I use.
I absolutely love that. And I just am musing with the thought that I wonder what our challenge is evolutionarily from the physical form that makes us continue to default to that piece. And so that's one of the big signs.
I'll tell you what my interpretation is of our latest evolution.
Okay.
So our latest evolution goes by 2 letters, AI. Artificial intelligence. And what AI is showing seems to be really close to actual intelligence, right? So they're like, if you just take ChatGPT, the initial manifestation of ChatGPT was basically copy and paste, right? I'm predicting the next word, but really I'm taking what already exists and kind of sending it back to you. But there are these experiments that the researchers did with the ChatGPT 4 where it actually shows thought. Like, for example, I was listening to an interview, a podcast with this one guy who was a researcher, and he said, I was thinking about what tests I could give it, because if you give it all the information on the internet and now you want to test it, how do you test it with something it's never seen before? So he was like, okay, here's what I'm going to do. it's not a drawing AI, but maybe it can draw. So I'm going to ask it, use this very obscure programming language and give me a code to draw a unicorn.
Mm-hmm.
And so based on the limits of that code, it couldn't draw like a really vivid unicorn, but it could draw basically using rectangles and ovals and triangles the shape of a unicorn. It's like, there it was, right? So then they're like, okay, let's do it like this. Let's take this code and modify it to remove the unicorn's horn and rotate it so it doesn't even look like a unicorn anymore. And say, here's a code of a unicorn, put the horn on its head, put a horn on its head with triangle. And it did it. Right? So something that doesn't even look like a unicorn, right? So this level of thought. Now, the next thing is, there is a recent result in archaeoanthropology or whatever you call it, where these early humans called Neletis, in this cave in South Africa, they found these bodies deep in this cave. And so there's two things that humans began to do 78,000 years ago. These cats were doing it 160, like the first evidence of humans burying the dead, 78,000 years ago.
Sure.
These bones could be potentially as old as 500,000 years ago, but minimally like 300,000 years ago. And so caching is when you take, like when you look at the Dogon, where they have all the bodies in the caves and the cliffs right there. That's called caching. Burying the dead. So two of the skeletons are completely intact, or in these oval-shaped depressions where it looked like, based on the way it's disturbed, like they were actually buried. And then at the same location, they have cave markings, like they were, doing tombstones on cave walls or something like that, right? Now, all other anthropologists are like, well, you can't say it was them that did it because you can't really date those. It could have been some later humans that came in there. But the burying and caching thing are still pretty amazing. But here's the thing. Those cats had really tiny brains, just like AI has a really tiny brain today.
Right.
So what this is saying to us is, we thought intelligence was this, our super brain, we slowly developed it and we're so unique. But really, intelligence may be really easy, is the thing. Maybe all we're doing is predicting the next word. It's so we've given it this sort of like aura of amazingness, but now we're seeing that, you look at like, chimpanzees use spears to kill monkeys, right? They use simple stone tools. That humans were in the Stone Age for 2 million years before we came out, right?
Exactly.
Before we started doing metals and such, right? And so, the early pre-Homo sapiens humans who were doing this stuff, if nothing else, they showed that these Homo neletis were doing this for generations.
Right.
To do something this organized required a type of communication beyond what chimpanzees and gorillas are doing. It requires some sort of language, right? So we didn't think other brains were capable of that, but it looks like maybe they were.
Right.
Now we see that the computer overnight is capable of that.
I love that you said intelligence is much easier than we think it is.
Yeah.
Because I think if that were spoon-fed to every child, then where would we be in this world? We would have these amazing people who are just doing everything that is, counter to the hierarchies, counter to everything.
Right. Well, the other problem is, one of the things I love about the Hakeem, I thought I was dumb until I met you, is, I'll be walking in the mall. And some man and his kids will come up to me. And they're like, the way he speaks, I know he's from the undereducated community, just like me.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
And he was like, yeah, man, you made me this is what people have said, I'm quoting people, right? Man, you made me rethink my relationship with science. I think now I'm going to go to college and do this. Because we always talk about educating the children. You cannot educate the children without educating the people older than the children. It's true.
Their caretakers are
Absolutely.
pivotal.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I also recognize, and you and I have talked about this before, where you recognize that you have to provide opportunities, right, for people to be able to find a way, or to help facilitate helping them to be able to find a way. And so that's where, for example, another project that I'd worked on it's called Redemption Botanicals. And so in Illinois, when the governor at the time, big things, the platforms that he was running on was to legalize cannabis. And so the idea was, okay, well, I'm going to legalize this. It's going to provide a great revenue opportunity. But then, like myself and many others who are in that community, was asking, well, what happens to the people who had been incarcerated, especially those that were coming from BIPOC community, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, right? So the question was, what happens to them? Do they get their records expunged? And then do they get the opportunity to be able to be participants
To
so
participate
that they could
the industry, like to be
Thank you.
legitimized.
That's correct, right? And so Redemption Botanicals came from that desire where we brought together a group of people who were investors. They had backgrounds in business and finance and training, behavioral sciences. And we had the minority ownership helping what were called social equity applicants, right? So these are the people who would be the ones that were incarcerated or had some particular issue. And so if they were interested in getting a license, in our case, we helped to be able to fund them getting the license and creating that opportunity that would help them to learn about what it would take to be able to run such a business, right? Because it's capital intensive and so many regulations, and there's so many hoops to jump through and so many ways of just becoming so overwhelming. And so we created a partnership to be able to help people who were seeking to do that.
And so where does that stand now? The law has been passed. How are you seeing it actually, impacting the community and those formerly incarcerated?
My understanding, so because we live in Minnesota, my partner and I were the ones participating in Redemption Botanicals, which was created in Illinois.
Right.
The records were expunged. There were hundreds upon hundreds of records. Since about 2018, 2019, and even until now, there were not enough licenses that were available for all of the hundreds of people who put in applications, right? And the local government was trying to figure out how to address those issues as well as many others that presented themselves, because there were a lot of obstacles, a lot of opportunities, and trying to find creative ways to make sure that the process was equitable was a little bit of a challenge. So unfortunately, there were some lawsuits that were put into place to just basically make sure that there were more opportunities in terms of licenses going into lotteries, for example, right? So that you could have a fair chance at it. So we're still in the process of going through all of the legal challenges right now, but there are some people who did get licenses to open up dispensaries and grow facilities, and we're still moving through that process.
I mean, it's fairly young, I guess. So we'll see what the next 3 to 5 years brings, because I think it's just like across the board in New York, the same thing. I think that's the major push now. Just like there's big agriculture now, there's big cannabis, that really focusing on the communities that have been disadvantaged because of the legal system is real. This is called real. So
it is. Yes.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that work. So speaking of mindset, and as a behavioral psychologist, I'm sure mindset is something that you think about quite often. So tell us what your favorite or innovative mindset hack is. So this is one that you practice, one that you know of, or one that you can imagine.
Wow. So in the last probably 2 years, I have been working on, if you will, quieting the saboteurs, the inner voices that keep you up at night, that force the ruminating thoughts, that foster self-doubt, Those voices that make you less compassionate towards yourself and others because you're just too busy either judging yourself or others or a particular situation. And when you do that, it becomes very counterproductive. So I have really made it my goal to quiet those saboteurs, those judges, the victim saboteurs. There was this wonderful program that my partner introduced me to called Positive. And the founder and creator is just, he did a lot of basic hacks, if you will, that are very similar to the idea of Beyond the Fork and that interpersonal play. And he packaged it in just such a brilliant way in little small bite-sized pieces to help promote mindfulness. And, I love that word saboteurs because that's exactly what those ruminating thoughts do.
Yeah, most definitely. The doubt, that just kind of take you away from the present. And what was that? Agenics? What did you call it?
Oh, positive intelligence.
Positive intelligence. Ah, okay. So folks, we have good show notes. So that'll be in the show notes. So yeah, that sounds like a great hack. Okay. So our time is slowly drawing to a close. I could obviously, you and I can gab for forever, but I want to be mindful of your time. So I want to ask a little bit more about, let's go back over the ocean and talk a little bit more about what's next and new and how you see yourself moving forward with the St. Bernard's Hill House.
Absolutely. So in terms of St. Bernard's Hill House, honestly, my vision for the Virgin Islands, both US and British, is to create an economic engine, the island equivalent of the Black Wall Street, powered primarily by young entrepreneurs of color who own property and businesses. And I really want to impress on your listeners that I'm really grateful for my partnerships with non-BIPOC individuals who understand that in order to have true collaboration with BIPOC folks, you don't lead from the front. You learn, you listen,
right.
You participate, you sit with, and you don't stand in front. You actually act as a conduit to provide access, which at times that can mean actually giving up your seat at the table. So I am really profoundly grateful to the partnerships that I've had with non-BIPOC people, because that has really helped to provide meaningful ways to be differences in the British Virgin Islands. And so with St. Bernard's Hill House, it is my desire, for example, that if someone is working with us who, has literacy challenges and they want to increase their literacy, I want to make sure that my team can make that happen. If, it's important for us that if they're signing contracts, for example, people sign contracts all the time and they find themselves in trouble because they don't have good contract acumen, that people understand, the contractors that work with us, they understand what they're signing. It's important also to make sure that people who are working with us, they, have financial literacy, for example. All of those things, I am hoping that when people hear Coterra, the company, or they hear St. Bernard's Hill House, they know that it's a place where we practice fair compensation, where people, it's a wonderful environment to work in, right? And so that's, for me, one of the ways to be able to kind of distribute that collaborative mindset into the community, to be able to hopefully make some type of a difference.
What is it like to open or to create a museum?
Right. So the museum is very fascinating the way it came about. It's kind of linked to already the story of why Kwatenga Media was also set up. We set it up as a way to kind of shift the narratives of Africa. And then the more we got into that space and started understanding, the dynamics of our political and social history and the impact on our contemporary lives, for example, what our historical education has done to how we understand how we live in our societies. For example, why do people live in shanty compounds? Why is it only, settler white people who control companies? Why is it that, when we're making business decisions at a very high economic level with politicians, we're always deferring to the foreign companies? Why don't, all that stuff we came across during our work with Kwatenga, and I always wanted to understand why we make certain decisions as Zambians. And it's not only Zambians, you'd see it play out in other countries as well. So I'd always speak to Mulenga Kapwepo, who was a cultural and historical specialist, and she would often tell these stories of our indigenous culture and then also our colonial and post-colonial experience. And it started becoming apparent to me that it had something more to do with how our experience of colonialism and post-colonialism affects how we make decisions and still affects how we make decisions. And I wanted to go deeper into that, into understanding the why. And then it started becoming more apparent that if we dig deep into the why and find a way to counter it, maybe this is something that could start transforming how we view ourselves, which inevitably impacts how we make decisions. And a lot of those things we found in our history, because when we'd understand how we'd interact historically, how our source communities made decisions, the democratic way, they entered negotiations, or the nutritional aspect of how we lived, or the leadership roles that we had historically, they made much more sense. They were much more democratic. They were much more engaging, inclusive, and it resulted in communities that were harmonious, that were productive. And we started wondering why we don't borrow from that. Like, why doesn't contemporary Zambia borrow from what was obviously a very valuable knowledge system? And we realized it had a lot to do with our own identity crisis and inferiority. I would call it a collective inferiority where colonialism disrupted and devalued who we were. And we had been unable since then to kind of like reclaim our own value. And it became apparent that this is the work that we need to do to try and reclaim that value and restore who we were as a people. And that's the museum, yeah.
Okay. So getting down to the actual curation and thinking about the vision for taking it from a digital concept to a physical concept to a center that might be someplace where people are actually coming together in scholarship and all those things. Where 5 years on, where are you and where do you see yourself moving next?
Right. So I think, when we started, we didn't think that it would end up or even get to the stage. I think it was an experiment. In many ways, it still is. The reason why we set it up as a digital space is that we didn't want to wait for a building for us to be able now to start communicating the work that we're doing. And I think that has really worked well because we've been able then to democratize the space, and we've been able to do research and collaborate and produce work that has become new knowledge, that is being used, that is being consumed, and new ways of museum making, because that's a big discussion now. The discourse is really huge in terms of entangled memories, the idea of museum making and the future of museums. Big part of the conversation in the space. And we feel very privileged that we're able to be a part of that conversation and contribute to it. Such that now when we're building the museum, we're working on the actual physical structure of the museum. It will allow us to reimagine museums in a new way. Because remember, museum is not African. The concept of a museum is a very European and Eurocentric way of producing knowledge. But it is the standard of producing knowledge. And even when we know that museum knowledge in terms of ethnographic collections they have from Africa are highly problematic, very distorted, decontextualized, and dislocated. So all the knowledge that is contained there is already problematic. And now there is a big wave to kind of like undo a lot of that work. And even as we're building our museum, we're very conscious of that and want to be aware that we're not repeating the same infrastructural ecosystem that is Eurocentric. We're thinking of what a museum would look like for an African purpose. And we don't have museums in Africa. The concept of museums doesn't exist in Africa. We live our histories, in our communities. They're lived histories. And so we're bringing that into the museum space as well. And that's a huge consideration for us.
Yeah, I guess when I think about it, I mean, would our museums have been monuments? Like, is that how we've lived it? But then somehow we've also passed down our histories, right? And passed down our stories. Yeah. And so I guess our museum concepts are our people.
Yes, exactly. So that we store our knowledge in the people, so that we call them knowledge keepers. So they're oral archives. And for many reasons, obviously, one of the reasons why we're excavating that knowledge from the oral archives and documenting it is because they pass on. In the ancient times, why we were able to maintain those living histories is because it was a very well practiced ritualistic practice where from generation to generation the oral archive was passed on and passed on and passed on. And, it's through our objects that we created, that history and knowledge remained. But because of historical, political, and social disruptions, that no longer happens. So obviously we have to think of a new way of storing and preserving these narratives. And this is some of the work that we're trying to develop.
One of my favorite themes that you can trace through the history of Ghanaian music is not just Ghanaian music, African music. Men who are mourning the fact that their woman has left them for a richer man. Yeah. So if Classic. You think of Premier Gao, that's what they're singing. Yeah. Like that song is literally a guy who is singing his pain. Right. Or Chin Chin Bieji. That song, that's the theme of that song. Sure, Azingele by Rough and Smooth. There are so many. Yeah. I feel like you could do a compilation album dedicated to jilted men. Yeah. And then you have the flip, the late Ebony Rains, who she's just like, yes, I am the one who's doing the jilting. Yeah, like if you break my heart, I'll date your father. Yeah. Yeah, and so there've been feelings. Yes. But generally speaking, the music is about having a good time and escaping. Sure. Right? Yes. But not so much anymore. Yeah, well, and it's a sign of the times. It's a sign of the times. Yeah. Yeah, it's like a lot more emphasis and understanding on mental health. Yep. And that, I feel, has been a bit more prominent in the alternative space for longer and is now entering the mainstream. Right. So speaking of different genres and thought, let's talk about mindset. Okay. I'm going to ask you what your mindset hack is. So I ask you to share your favorite or an innovative mindset hack. Now, this is one that you practice, one that you know of, or one that you can imagine. Okay. So what I would say is one of the things that I've always believed in and that I'm comforted to see more of is collaboration over competition. So when we were doing Dust, for example, once in a while, some new magazine will pop up and people would say, oh, you guys have competition now. And I'll be like, why would they be competition?
Right.
We would actually call them up and be like, can we help you guys? Are there any ways we could help you?
Yeah.
Which is just, that's not how Ghanaian business tends to operate.
Right, yeah.
But I think that it has a past and it has a future in the sense that we, like I was saying, the African spirit is a communal spirit. There are so many things that we do that have community in mind. And that's the way culturally we have been. For all the colonial influence and everything, there's certain things that we just, like, you just can't take away. And so, in as much as we can be as capitalistic and individualistic and stuff, I think that the spirit of collaboration and community will always take you further. And it's very necessary in places like Ghana where not everybody has. You have the have-nots as well. Yeah. And so it's kind of like this teaching of, you can go to school, for example, to learn how to be an engineer. Great. Why do you want to be an engineer? Is it just for your personal enrichment, or are you serving a greater purpose? And is that purpose perhaps the common good? And so I'm a very big believer in the common good. And I think that we achieve the common good with a mindset of collaboration. And I would take it a step further and I would say that one of the interesting things happening in the West is the West has moved from a time when it was a lot more communal into this very individualistic period that it's in. And something that it is struggling with is the advent of social media. Because what social media is, it's really taken over and it's forcing them to think in slightly more communal ways. And you're starting to see, it's like the rules of engagement on social media tend to be very toxic. So you think of Twitter, for example, or you think of Facebook, and it's
just the fights.
The fights and stuff like that. And people
bullying.
are being forced to learn over time that, yes, you can cancel someone, but you also run the risk of getting cancelled yourself. So how authentic can you be in this space? You know, people are being forced over time, very slowly, to understand that there's a value to empathy and thinking beyond yourself. And that's the way the people who started the internet, like the Sir Tims and those guys, that's how they envisioned it at first before corporations got involved.
Right, yeah.
It was supposed to bring us together.
Right.
Think about things like crowdsourcing.
Right, yeah.
People who go online and they pull together, essentially, to build things.
Yeah.
This is a wildly African thing. And so to me, I see that Africa actually has a lot to teach the rest of the world about what it means to be communal. And if we went back and we studied a lot more of that communalism in our history, it would have application today in spaces like the internet, in spaces like social media. But we have that disconnect. So I try personally, as much as I can, to think about things from the perspective of the common good. And I really think that when you think of a place like Ghana, there are two Ghanas. I think that there are people in Ghana who are thinking about, let's say, themselves and their families. And then there are the people who are thinking of the common good beyond that, beyond their own circles. That's why I love the counterculture scene, because there's a care that is shown for people who you do not personally know.
Sure. Yeah.
That's what activism is about.
Yeah.
And there was a point in our history where we all pulled together. And that's what brought us independence. And so we've kind of moved, we've drifted from that, but I feel like we have a chance to turn the boat around and be more communal. And I'm seeing it in the music. I feel like culture is often a predictor of where we can go.
Yes. And it is how we go, typically, right? It's the creative arts and everything that typically moves culture and moves people. And I like what you said about the collaborative mindset, because I've just kind of been really thinking about this in terms of democracy, and democracy is done.
Yeah.
It has failed Africans. However, the foundations of what it means to be in a democratic society, we already knew that.
Yes.
We just had so that's basically what you're saying. We already had this communal mindset. We already knew. And so because democracy basically became a tool for capitalism,
yes,
that's where we've broken down.
Yeah,
so if
the
we
institutionalizing of democratic ideals, that institution hasn't worked.
Right.
But the democratic ideal, like you're saying, that spirit was there.
Right. It's inherent.
Yeah.
I mean, it's actually quite inherent in people as humans have evolved, right? So once we figured out that we have to work together to tend the land, because that's why we're here, right?
Exactly.
We're here to tend it. But beyond saying this is mine and that's yours, which then that's where the capitalism comes in, then we survived and we thrived.
Yes.
And so, yes, collaboration.
Yeah. And so in terms of it as a personal hack, in my dealings with people, I try as much as I can to move with the spirit, not of competition, but of collaboration. How can I help you?
Right.
And if I see you as being a common organism with me, then by helping you, I'm helping myself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
At law school, undergrad, I met Michelle Robinson, who was a student there. And then at law school, I met Barack. And, those are relationships that came as a set, meaning that there were a whole bunch of Black people who were like Barack and Michelle. They were very ambitious. They were brilliant. They were ready to change the world, and they are changing the world. And so that sort of network was something that was actually part of my experience, the same way that I'd had in Greensboro, North Carolina. I'm sure the same way my parents had it in Tuskegee, that all of a sudden I grew a bit more and a bit more broad and also a bit more powerful. And that group has therefore shown its power and exerted it in various places. And I just I was asked to be part of a committee on a topic that's actually very interesting to me. But the most interesting part of this is not that it was an appointment by the president, but that it was run by Cathy Hughes. And Cathy Hughes is a self-made billionaire, Black woman who is running out of the Small Business Administration, a council. The name of the council is unimportant. What's more important is the impact of what it was doing. It was studying what are the ways in which we can work with underrepresented groups in order to make sure that with government contracting and their set-asides in the United States, that those organizations have sufficient capital to be able to really expand and become key suppliers for the government, as opposed to, sort of opportunistic suppliers for the government. And so, because they're, what is it? We just saw something from Lockheed Martin or something that's trying to create some fighter jet, and they have spent, $44 billion. So the amounts of money which are available for partnering are absolutely extreme. They're very large checks that are available, but most Black businesses that are working in the set-aside program are working for relatively small amounts of capital. And so the question of what is wrong and why are we not able to actually make those organizations bigger, and what do we need to put in place in order to make that happen? So, and to work with Cathy Hughes, a person who's having started with one radio station and then built that into an empire, was really a great privilege. And a Black woman being in that position, I thought that was like I was in heaven. That was heaven.
I can imagine. So before we get into what you're doing now, because that feels like it dovetails perfectly with where you are now, what you're doing, I want to ask about Glocal Speak. So we want to hear what you hear. So I ask you to share a word, a phrase, or a saying that is a meaningful part of your local experience, and why or how you come to value it as Glocal Speak.
1 in 2 Black children in the UK live below the poverty line. That just makes your blood run cold.
1 in 2.
1 in 2. That figure came from 2018, before the pandemic and before we had this crisis of inflation and the crisis of the cost of living. So every time you see a Black child on the street, you see 2 of them together, 1 is living in poverty. That is everything, in my opinion. And so that sort of quote is what actually keeps me up at night. the question of what are we doing? How do we actually not take to the streets as Black people, white people, whomever, underrepresented people, to say that this cannot stand and that we need to do something about this immediately? And why is it not the first thing on every agenda? Why is it not the last thing that we talk about before we leave as to what is the way in which we're going to impact it today?
That's perfect. And a segue into what you're doing now. So you are a co-founder of Impact X Capital. That's a double bottom line investment firm. So tell us about Impact X and what you're doing.
So back in 2018, this statistic and some help from some other people helped us to say that probably we should focus on a solution. And if not us, who? If not now, when? So a group of people got together at a friend of mine's house to talk about, and there are about 40 people who were invited, Black leaders from education, from government, from business, from sports, from entertainment, to talk about what it is that we can do to help Black Britain. And that became, one of the things that they decided is that every solution that they came up with as a possible answer required capital. And so the question was, are we going to continue to go hat in hand to somebody else and say, believe in what we believe in, prioritize what we prioritize, and keep it in your sights no matter what else is happening in the world? Or are we going to do it ourselves? And so they asked me, because I'm an operating executive, having spent time in the consulting firm afterward, I then went into these technology companies as an operating executive to make them grow and help them to grow and help them to flourish. And so they said, Eric, maybe you can put this together. And so from a standing start, I went out and studied where were the challenges associated with funding. And was this a challenge that required grants? Is it a challenge that required debt and lending? Or is it a challenge that could be addressed with some other sort of means? And I put forward the hypothesis that I believe the greatest impact could be made if indeed we invested in companies using venture capital as the means and try and grow companies of scale that would eventually get to rival some of the biggest companies we've ever seen. And in the process would actually create a great deal of wealth, not only for the immediate stakeholders, employees and founders and other sorts of things, but then shareholders, et cetera. And then indeed, it would also create jobs that were future resistant. And if we did that, we would then have a change. And then within a short period of time, because the other thing is we can't take forever to do this, Black Britain could be improved. And we could address that concern. So that's how Impact X came about. We expanded the vision a little bit, not just to the UK, but to Europe. We decided, I did some research about where were there pockets of opportunity, i.e. both there were individuals who had participated in industry sectors for a while, and they had also been successful and then been able to see been able to see cycles of growth and contraction, et cetera, and therefore could come up with disruptive solutions that were going to work. And then from there, make that into a question of sort of what was going to be our investment thesis, what kind of money would be investing, what sort of size checks at what stage, and what would be the return possibilities. And that became Impact X, which now invests in digital technology, health education, well-being, and media and entertainment in Europe and the UK, and focuses specifically on underrepresented people because there's a market inefficiency. Proportionate capital doesn't go to women and people of color or to other underrepresented groups And so we take that market inefficiency as a great reason to recast as an opportunity, and we invest in that opportunity for market scale returns and then job creation. That's what I do.
So the millions of dollars question. So your first bottom line is, of course, returns, right?
Absolutely.
And then the second bottom line is the impact.
Job creation.
So that is the metric. So it is really about how many metrics. Okay.
How many jobs do we create? And for women and people of color, we actually on a quarterly basis measure with our investment with companies in which we invest, which are called our portfolio companies. We ask them to tell us how many people of color and how has that changed from quarter to quarter. Sure. If there's ever a problem with it, we then sort of help them to come up with a plan to make sure they get back on the right track.
So do you look at also kind of the turnover of the company's funds or revenues in communities, underrepresented communities? It's just the capital and the business doing the business.
What we know is there are all sorts. There's been a great study called Give Black, which is about Black philanthropy. It's specifically focused on the UK, and it shows that Black people disproportionately use their capital in order to underwrite particular types of projects, which are Black projects. And it can be education, it can be church, it can be early childhood, whatever it is. And that money, when they have more, actually goes more toward Black organizations. So what we do know is that Black people tend to, and women tend to hire more Black people and women. They tend to promote more Black people and women. They tend to share with more Black people and women. And then when capital is available, they have a tendency to over-index in terms of then reinvesting in Black people.
Thanks for joining us for this Black History Month compilation. As always, you can catch new episodes of the podcast at glocalcitizenspod.com or wherever you get your podcasts. Please like, share, subscribe, leave us a review. 100 in 2024, that's our goal. It helps others find great content on the internet. Until next time, bye for now.